Welcome to the Art of Franchise Marketing. Each episode takes a deep dive into the franchise space and explores how the biggest and best brands handle national branding, franchise development, employee recruitment, and localized marketing on a daily basis. This podcast is brought to you by Medsertive, a localized digital marketing partner for franchise networks. Medsertive talks shop with franchise executives to discuss what's working, what's not, and answers the question, what else can you be doing to excel at the art of franchise marketing?
Oh,
All right. Hello and welcome to the Art of Franchise Marketing podcast. I'm your host, Erin Martin, and this episode is brought to you by Medsertive. Today, our guest is Kenneth Schweighofer, the CMO of Authority Brands. Kenneth, thanks for joining us today.
my absolute pleasure, Erin.
So to kick us off, I'd like to first give our audience just to share a little bit of the background on you and then your current role at Authority Brands.
Yeah, to summarize it, I started my career post-college as an architect and then went back to get my MBA in real estate finance, which ties back to the way that I do things as well, which you hear later on. But went back to get my MBA in real estate finance, and while I was there, my marketing professor grabbed me and said, "You're a brand manager, you just don't know it yet." And then got me to commit to doing a dual MBA in both marketing and finance, which I completed. And then when I finished my MBA, it was really a choice of I could either go into development, which is what my entire objective was, and that door would be open forever, or I had a one-shot opportunity to go into marketing and do brand management. So I took my role, went into brand management, spent the primary bulk of my career at a company called Reckitt, which if you follow CPG is one of the largest CPG companies. Everybody knows the brands. Lysol, Merwick, Mucinex, Dalsum, Famil, French's when I was there before they sold to McCormick's, and spent most of my career there learning marketing in a CPG capacity, which is extremely detail-oriented, extremely driven by leadership and driven by ownership of P&L. So that's where the background of my finance actually helped, because when we were putting together proposals, driving the innovation, looking at the marketing support metrics, somebody that has a financial background or that education that I had, it actually pulls it all together. My last role at Reckitt was a regional director of North America as we were splitting the business into two units, the health side of the business and the household side of the business. And then did a small stint at Sanofi in the pharmaceutical space, and then from there jumped into the franchise space at ServiceMaster to start with, facilitated the sale there, was there a couple of years as their head of marketing, facilitated the sale, learned franchising, learned consumer services, which is a very different dynamic than CPG. And then played in private equity for several years, and now I'm the CMO at Authority Brands, which is one of the largest franchise networks with 15 brands in the portfolio, about $2 billion system-wide sales, and roughly about 2,600 territories and almost 1,500 franchisees.
Awesome. And I'm curious with that kind of rich backdrop of marketing experience, but starting with CPG as you've gotten into franchising, where do you think franchise marketers get it wrong, or what advice would you have for other franchise marketers that have been in that industry most of their careers with all of those? Even the PE perspective is awesome to have that other hat.
It is.
What advice would you have or thought on that?
So I tell you where franchisees get it, I think it's the franchise marketers get it right, which is probably the best place to start. At least the good franchise marketers. The best franchise marketers always start with the objective of driving franchisee growth. And that is by far and away the best place to start. There's a lot of marketers that do things trying to figure out how can we increase the revenue side of that, the DOS side of the franchisor side of the business table. And they're looking at different ways of manipulating the numbers or moving things around or moving into different types of profit metrics. But at the end of the day, nothing is anywhere near as sustainable as actually focusing on franchisee system-wide sales growth. So franchise marketers, where the good ones really drive impact, is laser focused into making sure that the franchisees are successful, right? So that's what they do right. I think where there's some gaps that I've seen consistently across marketing professionals within the franchisee space is, number one, they get completely bogged down with the complexity of what does the franchisor own versus what does the franchisee own? And so every marketer interprets that in different ways. And so some marketers believe that the role that the franchisor has is to really step in and be like the go-to person for driving that synergistic behavior. Other marketers have gone in and taken the approach of, hey, my role is to identify the vendors for you. You're on your own for driving performance. And I think that's a misstep because it's an easy thing to do because it's easy to not have to take all the time for organization and driving KPIs to drive performance. However, by not being fully engaged, are you really going to be driving system-wide sales at the franchisee level, knowing full well that the very first thing I communicated was that is what is going to drive ultimate long-term viable success.
Yes, that's great advice. And I think one thing I'm curious too, maybe related to that, is I know you started about a year ago. And so when you jumped in, like, where did you start? How do you approach a new role? And then especially given 15 different brands that you're looking at individually, like, how do you even approach that, understand where each is at from a P&L perspective and the dynamics that are happening with the ZOR and the franchisees? Like, what did your first few months or 90 days look and how you approached it?
Yeah, extremely complicated, right? Especially when you talk about 15 different portcos. Because there's a lot of dynamics that you have to take into consideration. Dynamic number one is what's the culture of the organization. For me, it's a little bit easier for me from a couple of regards. Number one, I've been playing in the private equity space for quite some time. So I was familiar with multiple different facets and types of approaching the culture within how different organizations work. And number two, I'd even been working specifically on Authority Brands in the background prior to ever being engaged directly with the business, which helps out tremendously because I knew a lot of dynamics. So when I came on board, the first thing I wanted to do is understand the culture. I have a philosophy that has two real important pillars to it. Pillar number one is you don't make any sudden changes when you come onto an organization. If you assume that you know better when you come on board, then the question is, are you really given it a chance to understand the dynamics of what's there? And can you really make a recommendation for a move if you don't understand the dynamics that are played first? I never try to make a move too quickly or try to make any changes too quickly, because if you want to know what the best thing is going to be for driving long-term viability, you have to understand where you are and you have to understand how you got there. And Authority Brands is a great example because I think that there are some changes needed. I believe that the way marketing was completed at Authority Brands or facilitated Authority Brands as they were compiling this portfolio together, the reason they got to this point was because of how marketing was done historically. So first and foremost, nothing's done wrong, because how you got to where you are, which is a successful point, was a direct byproduct of the work that was being done to get you there. So when I look at my predecessor within the portfolio, the very first thing I have to do is acknowledge, hey, look, there's greatness here that got us to where we are, right? And then the next step is, what's the end goal of what we're trying to achieve, and what pivots do I believe that we need to make in order to get to that spot, right? So the first several months was done evaluating the business. So I'll tell you a couple of things that I did at Authority Brands. I identified that a marketing brand plan at the business level had actually never been completed. Or if it had been completed, it wouldn't be in the framework of what I would consider a brand plan. So I very quickly came on board and had each one of the brands like dive into this entire brand planning process. And it gave me a headway or some insights into a couple of very key things. Insight number one, what are the marketers thinking? What are their focus areas? What's driving performance? What are they trying to dive into? What do they think their focus areas should be? How are they engaged with the franchisees? Like, all those different dynamics come out as they're presenting their brand plans. The second thing that I was doing this for is to understand, like, I knew that some changes need to happen, and I wanted to see who would be part of that culture shift / that next phase in the environment. So this really was a test, a test and testament to how we were going to move forward. The third thing was I wanted to understand how marketing would engage with operations. And it was really funny because I would say that operations, for the most part, and of course, I'm going to leave individual names out, but for the most part, operations objected like vehemently against the work of doing a marketing brand plan. And what they didn't realize was the whole objective of this was to get a foundation so that we could actually like more fully satisfy and deliver the needs of the operational organization. Because marketing is fundamentally in consumer services, not CPG, because in CPG, marketing drives everything. Consumer services and franchising, marketing is a support organization. And so your approach has to be very different. It has to be much more of a collaborative approach. And so got a lot of headwinds and pushbacks from operations. But the funny thing is when it came to the end of the year, when they were submitting their operational plans, every single one of those brand presidents, with zero exceptions, leveraged our building blocks that we established marketing in the presentations of what the operating plan was going to be for 2025. So I thought, even though there was no credit given to marketing, I thought that was a massive win, right? Is that they clearly were listening. And it also told me like which marketers were actually collaborating with the operation versus the ones that were opposed. Then at that point, it was really about taking a step back, and the marketing team there was 98 marketers in the organization.
Yeah.
And there's a huge marketing team. And so the question was, number one, do we have the right organizational structure to support the business the way we think we needed it to be supported? And then phase number two is, do we have the right structure, and how do we get to the right structure? Number two, do we have the right butts in seats? And if not, how do we get the right butts in seats? So there's going to be an evolution. And so I very quickly used that marketing plan process to identify how we needed to build the structure, align that structure with the operational partners, implemented a big shift and change in the marketing support structure for the organization. And then since then have been moving little pieces here and there to make sure that we have the right butts in the seats so we can actually drive performance.
Yeah. I love that. And just to break down the brand plan, because that sounds like a CPG type world that you have great experience with. So for the marketers that are not familiar, can you just break down the major components of a brand plan that you tasked every brand president with?
Yeah. So I think the brand plans have to be specific to the individual brand. That's first and foremost. So there's a template, but there are components of the template that would not be relevant to certain businesses that are relevant for other businesses. And so the brand plan, so there's two different things. There's the brand plan and then there's the marketing plan. So the first thing that I did was the marketing plan process. And what that was to understand more about how is marketing being supported at the franchisee level? What's the vendor relationships that we have? What's that network that we have? Because we have a whole roster of vendors. We have 47 different marketing vendors that we work with. So 47 companies that I have to deal with. How are we looking at performance? And what is that performance like delivering to the bottom line in the form of KPIs like CPL, CPAC, all the different details behind that. And every business has different levels of KPIs to looking at. And then from that point, how do we create a building blocks, like a simple waterfall chart that shows this is where we are. These are the investments that we're making within a market and focus areas we're making within a marketing perspective. And this is the revenue delivery, incremental revenue delivery that we expect from these different activities driven by these specific KPIs, driven by these specific investments. And so there's a whole building blocks that was created, and it was a process that none of the teams had gone for. And what was really interesting in the process, going into some of the details, is the teams that I thought that were best poised to perform and deliver an amazingly detailed brand plan were the ones that actually fell completely flat. Like one of the businesses, and I'll, of course, for obvious reasons, I'll keep it top line as much as I can. One of the businesses, they had an in-person kickoff. They had all of this detail going into it. They had an amazing level of understanding about attribution, the modeling, the vendor relationships, all that. So when they went into it, I thought, this is going to be the business that is best poised for delivering a robust marketing plan. The word like the least detailed output, least useful output across all the businesses, which was really interesting to me. And then there were other parts of the portfolio that did not have attribution modeling defined, had inconsistent type of KPIs, did not have even data aggregation or dashboards to understand performance at a franchisee level. And those are the ones that actually had extremely thoughtful and robust building blocks with detail on delivery, spreadsheets that actually validated all of the components. It was super impressive. So there were some people of the team even that my initial view was not very positive of course, the jury's always out, but you always have an initial perspective, that were incredibly impressive. And then there were other people that I thought were key foundational building blocks or foundations for the marketing team that ended up just not being, some of them are actually no longer with Authority Brands right now, but it was interesting to see the performance under pressure of doing a marketing plan. And then this year for 2025 is the very first year that we're actually doing cohesive, thoughtful, thorough brand plans aligned between marketing and operations. So we're taking the marketing plans as a building block, and then there's a collaborative effort between marketing and operations that are actually building brand plans, right, in a very succinct way, so we can understand not just the marketing components, but also the operational components that build into those things.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. And then how do today, where you're sitting and how you're envisioning the company and portfolio of brands, how had that shared services switched from what got you here to where you think you guys can get in the future? And what is that shared services and the way that you have structured morph? I know there's a ton of other companies going out there that are trying to build portfolio companies, acquire, and hopefully one day get to the size that you guys are. So curious how you see your next step of growth looking like from that shared perspective.
So I think what's really interesting is I look at it. The very first thing I did when I did the analysis, when I did the restructure for the marketing team, is try to understand like where does marketing fit in with the overall business, right? From a support services standpoint. And one pushback that I got from operations, which I think everybody that's in marketing or anybody that's listening to this that is a marketing professional within franchise probably experiences, is operations, which typically is the foundation of franchise organizations, will push back and say that marketing should report up through them, period, full stop. And support services should just listen to the direction and deliver upon that. And I think that's the initial reaction, of course, would be, that's of course a mistake. You need to have collaboration in order to drive success. But as you think through the process, there's different brands that are very different spaces in their development towards becoming a robust national presence. And so what I did is very different. And it wasn't, I think it raised a couple of eyebrows in the way that I did this, but I actually split the business into 4 different categories, right? So category 1 was the emerging brands. These are the smaller brands that were less than 100 million in system-wide sales, that had less than a certain number of locations, that didn't have any, like still, and I say this in quotations, but determining the viability of the model. And by that, I don't mean that the models aren't viable, because otherwise we wouldn't have pulled them into our portfolio. What I mean is still trying to understand what that scalability really look like. So those businesses need to be treated very differently than businesses in the rest of the portfolio. And while I'm talking about this, I'm actually going to pull up a reference, but is 2 things that I'll share. So if you look at this, what I did is I took every one of our brands and looked at the number of locations and then looked at the growth CAGR expectations to understand, can we actually split them into different businesses that need to be performed and supported in very different ways? And what really popped out is there were 4 different groupings, right? And those 4 different groupings led to this, which is trying to understand, okay, if I can bucket these into 4 different buckets, each one of these needs to be supported in a different way. And there's some very clear implications to that. So if you start on the right side, the emerging brands are relatively new brand concepts, roughly around 50 million in system-wide sales, right? They're being built for future growth. And the question is, like, we really need to focus on entrepreneurship, speed to market, flexibility, asking forgiveness, not permission, and being hyper local in all the activities that we were doing. So what are the implications for that? The implications to that are that the marketing professional, the marketing manager that supports a business, needs to actually report to the brand president, because the brand president doesn't need to go to a centralized structure and say, hey, do we have permission to do this? Or we have this, or can I go to this vendor? Or can I use this? Or the brand president needs ultimate accountability, ownership, and control. And they're small enough that there's nothing detrimental that could really be done with that level of control and autonomy. And a very controversial move that I made is I said, okay, for those businesses, I'm actually going to make the marketing manager report up to the brand president and then have a dotted line back into marketing, because I want them to be flexible. And I want to really convey that it's important. It's really critical and important that they have the ability to do what they need to do to be entrepreneurial in the way that they're showing the viability of the model. And once they get to a certain size, then the question is, do we have, I call them a scalable brand. So we have 4 brands that fall in what I call the scalable brands model. And this is where, from that point on, everybody reports up through marketing, right? And there's a VP over the scalable brands. And those brands are brands that are really focused on taking a model that's been vetted through, expanding the revenue per customer, stabilize the brand, defining what they stand for, and really getting franchisee alignment. So basically pulling all of your systems together so that you have a limited number of vendors for every single pillar of marketing activity. You have more cohesiveness, you have more of a national presence, et cetera. You're putting in the building blocks in together, right? And so those teams typically have 3 marketing professionals on them. They report up through a single VP of marketing, right? And those 2 professionals, you need one person that does omni-channel, one person that manages the brand, which would be the brand manager or the marketing manager for the brand. And then you have to have one specialist that kind of supports both the omni-channel and the marketing manager, right? So it's a 3-builder team. Then as they get to enough size, they have aligned platforms, aligned agents, et cetera. They move into the next bucket, which is this bucket here, the growth brands, right? The growth brands are brands that are substantive in size, have national presence. And these are brands that I've taken a directive of, you know what? Let's stop focusing on profit and let's focus on massive scalable growth. How do we actually have speed to lead, innovator mindset, thinking outside of the box, and get really quick, fast ramping of new franchisees? So for this business, for example, I have a program called SureStart, which is designed to really take a new franchisee and get them up to that $1 million threshold, right? Really quickly within 12 months by having like dedicated support that knows how you grow a business from nothing versus how you grow a business that has a presence already. So in those businesses, we're not focused on EBITDA, we're focused on system-wide sales growth. And then there comes a point where those brands have the right type of national coverage, the right type, like the most of the big territories already covered. And then they move into the stable phase, right? Which would be our core brands. We have one brand in there, TCA, which was the original brand for Authority Brands. And within that brand, it's having a national focus, making brand awareness key, having hyper focus on the consumer needs so that we can actually facilitate that franchisee support, right? And transitioning into performance marketing, where instead of actually just trying to drive system-wide sales, we're trying to drive conformance, reduce CPLs, increase profitability for franchisee, et cetera, et cetera. And by doing that and splitting the business into those specific buckets, I've facilitated this change in behavior where there's actually different types of individuals that we put into the emerging brands versus we put in the scalable brands versus what we put in the growth brands versus what we put in the core brands. And to facilitate all of that, I've created something called a marketing core competency matrix, which basically is, I'll share one more time, is a list of 10 core competencies. And I took, in my observations the first couple of months, I identified in 10 things: 4 business excellences, 3 marketing excellences, and 3 operational excellences. So basically understanding the brands, strategic planning and monitoring, cross-functional business consideration, franchise relationships, et cetera. So identify those competencies. And what we do is we actually map out the different competencies that are needed for each role within the organization. And then we map out every individual within the organization as to where their competencies lie to understand where's the best fit, like where are their strengths, where their opportunity areas, et cetera. And by doing that in a comprehensive way, we create this roadmap that's similar to this, where we say, hey, look, each core brand, growth brand, scale brands, like we have certain advanced needs, and each one of these is the competencies that I just showed you. These are the ones that they need to be advanced in, and these are the ones that need to be proficient in. And then when you map all of that out, all of a sudden you get into this point of view where you're no longer just putting butts in seats. You're actually focusing on very specific things, which becomes much more focused and becomes much more credible to the franchisees of the network because they know what you're trying to achieve.
Yes, I love that. And just for anyone who's listening who doesn't have a visual, I highly recommend that you jump back on and look at the visuals that Kenneth just walked through, because it's a great outline of those specific segments in a visual form. And I'm curious, when you were looking, like when you broke that apart, I love it for so many reasons, but it's basically breaking down that high level vision of the people, process, and technology that's needed, but bridging the high level and strategic outlines for each segment to the executional pieces needed for success. So I'm curious, in that very first visual you showed where you had those plots of the segments, did you always know those 4 segments would be where the different brands landed? Or did you play around with that, not knowing what they would be, and then that came out of the different analysis you did, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so there was roughly about 120 different ways that I plotted those axes.
Okay, wow.
So it was, I'm a bit of a numbers geek, and if anybody from my team watches this, or if they ever talk to you, they'll realize, yeah, he's a little bit too into the numbers and too data oriented.
Yeah, that's weird.
So what I do is we pull this apart in many different ways. We knew roughly which ones would land where they were, but there was a couple that were surprises. Mm-hmm. And quite honestly, I didn't even have 4 buckets. Like I didn't go into this saying, hey, look, there's 4 different buckets we need to put these in. I went in there and said, okay, amongst this portfolio, how do we divide this in a way where it actually makes sense? Because the previous leadership for marketing got Authority Brands to the place where Authority Brands is today by having a very laser focus on very specific elements. My approach to get us to that next stratosphere is to say, okay, that unilateral approach, we need to take a step back and say, okay, maybe that's not the right way for hitting that next scalable growth with this many brands. So how do we evolve? How do we recognize what drove success in the past and then evolve it into a way that we can actually split out the expectations for each one of the brands in the portfolio? For example, emerging brands, give them a chance to win. I think it surprised everybody when my recommendation came in bed. Nobody asked for it. I just said, hey, look, the brand president should have ultimate accountability, right? So even amongst our decision-making matrix for NAF expenditures, because I own that P&L, is the brand president on emerging brands has ultimate accountability for the leveraging of NAF resources. Now, I have a say in that, right? Of course, but the ultimate accountability is with the brand president. But on the larger brands, the ultimate accountability is me and market. And in those situations, my philosophy is a little bit different, right? My philosophy in those scenarios is, even though marketing has the decision-making authority about what we do from a marketing perspective, how we support the business, what vendors we go with, what KPIs we're looking at, et cetera, I've always taken the challenge with the team to say, hey, look, because we had a conflict just recently that we had to resolve, and this is how I resolved it. I asked the question that I was asked by my team, which is VP on my team, said, don't I have the authority to make this decision? I said, yes, you do have the authority to make the decision. However, the brand president is not aligned to the decisions being made. Are we making the right decision? Because decision-making is not just a power, it's a responsibility. And if you look at it with that framework, then you can take a step back and say, wait a minute, right? Maybe more collaboration is required. Maybe we shouldn't be doing things in isolation. And maybe we need to really be thinking about the way that we interact. Now, there's some complexities with that, because at the end of the day, I am forcing marketing to have that type of approach where we're always getting alignment, we're always collaborating. It slows things down because it's a process, but that slowing down in my mind helps things to be consistently moving forward versus moving faster and then having to take some of the stuff back. And so when you think about the
it reminds me of pardon me real quick. It reminds me of the slow is smooth and smooth is fast.
Yes.
Quote.
That's exactly right. And that's my philosophy. The build challenge on that is going to naturally be that in the end, it is highly dependent on the cross-functional partners like operations, et cetera, to start reciprocating that collaboration, which is something that's very slow to happen, but that's a culture shift that we're looking to prevail. And I will say, like, even members of the board that attended, like we had a marketing leadership team recently. We had 3 members of the board that I invited to attend a marketing leadership team meeting. And what was really interesting about that is there's a couple of interesting points. Number one, nobody on the marketing leadership team, even the ones that were there before me, had never met, engaged with, or had any interaction whatsoever with members of the board, which I think is a problem because we need to have that.
Yeah.
So that was one thing. And the board members, the same thing. They never had engagement that deep into the process. From the board perspective, the 3 members of the board, like one from each of the 2 major private equity firms that we deal with, and one of the independent directors that focuses on marketing activities, one of the feedbacks I got from them was they've never been given that visibility to how we do things and the culture about how we move forward. So I think we had a complete game change about the perception of marketing, which got down to our operational partners, and I think is facilitating this slow transition into collaborate a little bit more with us starting now. And then when they start seeing the wins, maybe they'll collaborate a little bit more. And it's a slow moving ball, but it's moving. And that's the important thing.
Yeah, I love that. And it's also so interesting because I think about other portfolio companies who, when they're building their brands, oftentimes they'll look at we're building brands for this one ICP. We've got the typical mom who is making purchasing decisions in either like health and wellness sector or whatever, and we're going to own this whole arena. And they think about shared services in the brand portfolio as, okay, we can replicate everything because we share the same decision maker. When no, there are so many other dynamics at play that you would want to segment the strategic marketing approach towards. And how do you just unsee and not go too far down a rat hole of like straight to marketing plan, but the brand plan? Back to your original kind of conversation, which I love. And I'm also curious, you said the 120 different other ways of looking at data. So I'm just curious, what are some of, like, literally, what are you pulling to then look at cohorts and segment and play with it? Like, what does that actually look like for you when you're pulling stuff?
Yeah. So I will tell you that it's really hard to find a story. That's the problem. And I
Mm.
really strained. And quite honestly, I went down so many different rabbit holes and I just wasn't seeing any consistencies that allowed me to get in that decision-making process. And so it was really dialing it back into a much more simplistic way of looking at the portfolio and then going down the rabbit holes on the individual businesses versus going down the rabbit holes in the portfolio, even the dashboards. So I'll give you an example. So marketing vendors, one thing that really sticks out to me is that we have so many different vendors that we're working with. It's incredible. It's ridiculous to me.
Yeah, you said 47. That's a
Yeah.
lot.
So it's incredible. And number one, I can't keep up with it and I can't have a relationship with all of them because there's too many of them. Number two, how do we drive performance at a franchisee level if we can't even like organize which vendors we're going with? And so I'll give you an example. So if we're jumping behind the scenes, which we do now, we didn't used to, but we do now under my leadership, the Center of Excellence team that I've got actually jumps behind the teams to look at key search terms that are being used, how the LSAs are being activated, like all the parameters behind the PMAX leads, like all those different variables are being managed by my team, which before it was the vendors managed it. But think about this. If I have 2 or 3 vendors that we have GLSA accounts with, you can manage the search terms that are being used, what those dollar amounts look like, what which look like pretty simplistically. But if you have 14, how do you possibly go between the platforms? The second part of that is attribution is like the big question mark that nobody can answer, right? Every single vendor looks at it differently. Every single platform looks at it differently. So what we're actually doing in the background, and this has been a long time coming, but we have a BI. So we have a new BI guy. We call him BI Joe. And Joe, his name is Joe Free. And so Joe is actually creating this platform of data integration so that we can create dashboards that deliver consistency amongst all the different market vendors within a framework. So to say it in a different way, every business unit is going to have a different dashboard because every business unit looks at different KPIs. And you have to do that if you're going to actually address the most impactful parts of each individual franchise group. However, we need to have unilateral attribution modeling to be able to compare vendors versus vendors. So think about a situation where you have a franchisee can look and see performance of one vendor versus another and then make the decision about who to go to based off that. Think about a situation where we can actually look at enterprise values of what's driving performance across the network, look at the underperformers and quickly identify what they're doing differently from the outperformers, change that, bring them up to average, take the outperformers, quickly identify what they're doing differently, and then change those variables for the average so the average comes up. And we do that on a business by business basis. So in order to do that, one of the big things I came to the table with is I said, hey, look, all of these crazy, insane contracts with like 20 addendums each that all conflict with each other in the trash. So taking our bigger vendors and we actually created different stipulations and we're creating MSAs that are very, number one, much more simplistic. So without all the addendums. Number two, they're requiring data integration with those systems. They're requiring ownership of all of our equities. I think in digital space, we're allowed that. So we're actually negotiating right now with one of our vendors that wants to own our digital assets. And we've said, no, like anybody that's going to play with us, we have to have ownership. Now, why do we have to have ownership? What happens when there's no performance? If you have to jump from one platform to another platform as a franchisee because performance is just not where it needs to be for whatever reasons, whether it be dynamics or whatever, it doesn't matter what the reasons are. What happens when you have to open up a whole new LSA account? There's a learning phase that goes through that. And then you have 3 months of either being blacked out, number one, or number two, the whole learning phase so you can get back up to speed just takes too long. And so if we own the accounts, we can facilitate the franchisee from being able to jump from one to another with no loss of learning, like AI learning, that really like dives into performance. And so that's one of the things that we're working towards is making sure that we have a couple of different components built into our contracts. And that has just been, it's a mess, but the end result that we're going to get out of this is what's going to drive our investment with the brand.
Yeah. And a stable foundation. Being on the vendor side, we see that all the time too, and have seen that huge transition to brands wanting to own their ad accounts, own their website, and then permission in partners to help, and then turn off permissions if there's a new partner. But I think with the mitigating downtime, there's also just that you are building the strong foundation that doesn't get pulled out from under you either. Like this cycle of just like cycling through vendors and almost like going through more hamster wheels when you've done so much hard work. It's build the foundation, don't hamster wheel yourself. So I love to hear that you guys are moving towards that. And I was even just talking to another franchise marketer on the kind of data normalization side, which it sounds like your BI Joe is tackling. We said they had to go through a year-long project. I think she called it her data baby because it took that long to normalize their price book and then be able to see what digital campaigns were converting from the lead to a sale with clean price book across all the brands so that they had just that clean data to work with for their BI and analytics. So it's a long haul. Like it's not easy, but it's so valuable. Like you won't get to where you're going with just messy data anymore.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about that, we have an incredible line of price books, like within the service site platform, within any of our CRMs. We have 9 different CRMs we work with, so that integration and the data lake that we're building, like that's where the complexity sits. But I will say that the risks. So just this morning, because we're negotiating with one of our premier, like one of our preferred vendors that does in the digital space. And just this morning in the negotiation, what they communicated out was if they were to agree to certain terms that within the contract that we're pushing for them, they basically said, hey, look, the challenge here is you're trying to commoditize us so that you can move on whenever you see fit. And that doesn't allow us to really drive performance. And I went back and said, wait a minute, but you want the performance metrics and key benchmarks to be taken out of the contract. However, you're telling us that you're the strongest performer within the industry. What I'm telling you is if you are a strong performer, by making sure that we have those abilities and that visibility and the API and the ownership to be able to pull the data that we need to pull and then feedback loop to Google, et cetera, then if you really are the best performer, you actually stand to win because other franchisees will see that, and then you will be having people flow over. Then once you've got that level of performance, then there's really no backing down because you create a behemoth. The challenge is today that we don't have that visibility. So you're telling us you're better performer, but I'll tell you what, everybody else is telling us the same thing. When we go look at dashboards, because you're all looking at attribution differently, we don't have a way of looking at mindful. So we can't even determine who the better performers are for anything other than system-wide sales or leads, because between the market dynamics and the different ways of looking at attribution, we can't even make recommendations. And so you're never going to get stronger. But if you truly are the best performer, giving us that ownership, giving us those rights, letting us have that type of credibility in the platform will demonstrate and prove that you really are the strongest performer. And then you stand to win in the network because of it.
Yes. Yeah. And the integrations, I love that you're requiring the integrations piece, not just for your BI project to be able to see everything and manipulate data, but that's how you then also can optimize towards what's working best. So often that piece is missing. You have marketers over rotating on CPL or some other metric that is an input. Like you want to have that as a piece to the puzzle, but it's not the whole puzzle. You want to be looking at that whole story and optimizing towards the right thing. And that piece is still missing, I think, with so many marketers.
Yeah. But stay tuned. It's also not something that happens overnight. So we've been working toward these things for about 12
100%.
months. And if you talk to some of the vendors that specialize in the franchise space, specifically the ones that work with us, you'll hear all the frustrations that they have because we're really tightening the screws on a lot of things. However, like we all stand to win. We all do.
Yeah.
And it's specifically the franchisees. And my end objective is really about driving franchisee performance, which we can't do flying blind in the way that we've been flying thus far.
100%. It's brought us completely full circle to how we started the combo, which I love it because we're almost at time. So I'm just curious if there's anything else that we didn't touch on that you wish we did. I know we came to a kind of short end here, so we're definitely going to have to do have you back on and 6 or 12 months check in.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that if there's one thing that I would say I would want to come across very clearly is the need to really focus on the franchisees. And that's something that's really missing in all of these marketers and operations people that focus on what we can do for this year's budget or what we can do for that. Sure, you'll win once, maybe twice with those things. But what they do is they create these barriers that prevent long-term viability. So in the situation I have at Authority Brands, for example, is there were all these things done to win on individual years for the P&Ls, but without the foundations, now we're taking a step back and thinking, okay, how do we actually create an environment and put in those foundational building blocks that are missing so that we can ratchet up into long-standing, long-term success at the franchisee level, which of course results in the royalty payments, which results in franchisor success as well. It's just, it takes time. And once you have that in place, then you can sit back and relax. But until then, it's one of the situations that we talked about before we started the recording, which is even my wife gets mad at me because theoretically on unlimited vacation, it's been a year. I have yet to take a single day, not even a Saturday or Sunday, because we really need to get this right. And we need to get this right because at the end of the day, I'm a firm believer that franchisees are people that put everything that they own into starting the business. And if we can't help and facilitate that growth so they can see a payback on that type of risk, then why would we be in franchising to begin with?
That's dedication to service and leading. I love it. Thank you, Kenneth, so much for coming on. I'm definitely not kidding about coming on for another episode down the line because we have so much more I'm sure we could talk about. We barely scratched the surface. So I so appreciate you coming on and sharing more of what you're doing at Authority Brands. And thanks to everyone who listened in to another episode of The Art of Franchise Marketing.
Great. Thank you, Erin.
Thanks for listening to The Art of Franchise Marketing. This show is brought to you by NetCertit. We help franchise brands and multi-location businesses run localized digital marketing at scale. To learn more, visit netcertit.com.